The 7th of November 1876 was Election Day in the USA, a day of excitement and anticipation. The streets were filled with lively crowds and saloons were packed until bursting. But this was not a day of fun and revelry for Keneally and his gang. Oh no, you see they had a job to do, a devious plan to carry out. Whilst everyone was distracted by the election, they would be stealing Abraham Lincoln's body.
No, why would they want to do that?
Well, stick around and you'll find out. Our story takes us to a very unlikely place, the hidden world of counterfeiting. Illegal, of course, but very lucrative. And it was made all the more lucrative by the American Civil War. During the war, the US government started printing the first official paper currency. Greenbacks, these notes were called, because green ink was used on their backs. And these new notes, well, they made for a counterfeiter's paradise. They were more complicated to copy than coins, but demand for these notes was enormous. So the counterfeiters did what they did best. They copied them. And by 1864, it's thought that 50% of the paper money in circulation was fake. This was an absolute disaster. How could the public trust that greenbacks were worth anything if most of them were phony? The economy was at risk of tanking. So, enter the Secret Service, created by the US Treasury in 1865. Sadly for Abe Lincoln, it would take 2 more presidents being assassinated before the light bulb switched on, and the government realised that maybe the president needed some kind of protection. The Secret Service was eventually given this job, but for now, their sole duty was to get rid of counterfeiters. Now, counterfeiting rings were actually quite complex operations. You needed shovers who would pass the money off as genuine in places like banks and shops. You also needed a well-connected network to distribute the coney, as the fake money was called, in different cities. Most importantly of all though, you needed an engraver, the heart of the operation. You see, the fake notes were printed using an engraved plate. It took an enormous amount of skill and attention to detail to make one. With a good plate, you could make copies of notes that were practically indistinguishable from the real thing. So now I need to introduce you to Ben Boyd, engraver extraordinaire. He was all set to join his family's engraving business in Cincinnati when a man called Nat Kinsey took him under his wing. To the outside world, Nat was known for his beautiful engravings of landscapes. But he had a secret. He could cut some of the best counterfeiting plates in the USA. He taught this skill to Ben, who would turn out to be an absolute natural. Before long, Ben became one of the most sought-after plate cutters. His plates were on another level. They were so accurate, so detailed, that even experts had a hard time telling that his notes were fake. Nat and Ben made a great team, printing top-notch coney. The higher the quality, the more you could sell it for. And Ben's engraving skills made him a very rich man. From one plate he made of a $50 bill, he was able to print $265,000, around $6.5 million in today's money.
Why are we wasting our time on YouTube? We should be counterfeiting.
Well, I can't deny that I was a teeny bit tempted. But you see, the coney life wasn't without risk. Ben soon found himself behind bars. Only for 2 years though.
Totally worth it.
Maybe. Anyway, after his release, Ben left Cincinnati and Nat Kinsey behind for Illinois. He began working with a man called James Keneally, a bigwig in the counterfeiting world that was about to get even bigger. James would soon run one of the largest counterfeiting rings in the Midwest, and his secret weapon was, well, of course, Ben. You see, all thanks to Ben, James, or Big Jim as he came to be known, had the best coney around. Very accurate, very difficult to detect. Big Jim was smart too. He orchestrated everything like a skilled puppet master, never touching a single phony bill himself. To top it all off, the operation was expertly hidden behind a very convincing front, a sleazy dive bar called the Hub. It was owned by Big Jim himself and a man called Terence Mullen, who was of course also in the counterfeiting game. Sadly for Big Jim, his whole empire was about to go up in flames. The Secret Service knew all about Ben Boyd. They knew that he was the heart and the soul of the counterfeiting world. They needed him behind bars, and for a very long time. Patrick Tyrrell, who worked for the Chicago branch of the Secret Service, hatched a plan. The Coney business was a cutthroat one. Everyone was out for a quick buck, and willing to stab their friends in the back for money. So he would use this to his advantage. He got in contact with Nat Kinsey, Ben's old mentor, and Nat was all too happy to help. For the right price, of course. Nat led them right to Ben, and they caught him in the act of making a plate for a $20 bill. Ben was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and just like that, Big Jim was ruined. The whole counterfeiting world would begin to crumble. You see, no other engraver could compare to Ben. Notes made using their plates were shoddy and far too easily detected. Big Jim needed a way to free Ben, and he came up with a truly scandalous plan. He would steal Abraham Lincoln's body.
Wait, how does this help Ben get out of jail?
Sit tight, I'm getting to that. Once again, Big Jim would not be getting his hands dirty. He contracted the Logan County Gang, one of his counterfeiting clients, and they would do all the heavy lifting. The plan was to break into Abe's tomb, steal his body, and then bury it in a ditch near the Sangamon River. News of Lincoln's missing body would cause a huge public outcry, and the government would of course do absolutely anything to get it back. Then came Big Jim's time to shine. He would pretend that he had innocently stumbled across the body whilst fishing on the river. Being the upstanding citizen that he was, he would return it, but only if they released Ben. A perfect plan, or so they thought. And even if they were caught, the penalty for grave robbing was only 1 year in jail. It was a risk worth taking for Ben's freedom. The gang went to scope out the Lincoln Monument to see what kind of security they'd be up against. They were greeted by the custodian, John Power, who showed them around Memorial Hall, but there was no tomb or coffin in sight. The gang asked where the body was, and John thought nothing of the question. It was actually quite a common one. John explained that there was a tomb chamber opposite Memorial Hall, and there laid Abe Lincoln, inside a marble sarcophagus. The tour continued. Visitors weren't allowed inside the tomb chamber, but the gang managed to see what guarded the body. It was laughable, really. Just 2 doors. The outer door was made out of wood with a glass window that could easily be broken. Now, the inner door would be a bit more tricky to deal with, but nothing major. It was a steel gate, secured with a padlock. They asked John if there was a night guard, and to their delight, he told them there was none. Honest Abe was so loved that security just wasn't really needed. With a joint scope, the gang were all ready to execute their plan. But somebody just couldn't keep their mouths shut. One of the gang members, Thomas Sharp, got unbelievably drunk and started bragging about the plot. Trying to impress a pretty woman, he blurted out that whilst everyone was celebrating, he was going to be out at Oak Ridge, stealing old Lincoln's bones. At first the woman thought that he was joking, it sounded absolutely ridiculous. But he assured her that he was deadly serious. She rushed off to tell the police, and their plan was foiled before it had even really begun. Big Jim was furious, and the Logan County gang quickly fled town, their tails between their legs. Big Jim wasn't about to give up on his plan though. He just needed to find a new gang that wasn't so useless. He'd round up his most trusted contacts in the Coney world: Jack Hughes, Terence Mullen, and Herbert Nelson. Now, they weren't too sold on the idea at first, but to make the deal even sweeter, Big Jim suggested that they add on another condition to returning Abe's body: $200,000 in cash. That settled it. The 3 men were on board, and they'd use the hub as their base of operations. Meanwhile, back at the Secret Service, Patrick Tyrrell had gotten some juicy information on Jack Hughes. Jack had been on their radar for quite some time now. He was a well-known coney shover, and Patrick now had it on good authority that Jack would often hang out at the hub. Now, Patrick couldn't just waltz into the hub himself. No, he'd be recognised. He needed what they called a roper, an ex-criminal looking to go straight, someone who could talk the talk and walk the walk. They'd weasel their way into Jack's circle, gather information, and then pass this on to the Secret Service. For a fee, of course. Patrick found the perfect man for the job: Louis Sweegles. Louis became a regular at the hub and my goodness was it really a dive. There was sawdust on the floor to absorb the spilled beer, and the spit. You see, it was such a classy place that customers would just spit on the floor. Lewis set to work on infiltrating Big Jim's gang. He was charismatic, knew how to tell a good joke, and often let it slip that he'd done time in jail. He hoped that it would help the other criminals that hung out at the hub open up to him. And it did. Eventually, he would meet Jack Hughes. Lewis hurried back to Patrick with the good news, and Patrick stormed down to the hub. Luckily, Jack had no coney on him at the time, but he was arrested for his previous crimes. Jack's friends rushed to his aid. They paid his $2,000 bail, and Jack was a free man again. Well, until his trial in January. Big Jim's gang were getting all ready for the heist when another spanner was thrown in the works. Herbert Nelson was getting cold feet, so they'd have to find another man for the job. Lewis was soon back at the hub. You see, no one knew that it was him that ratted Jack out. He played his part perfectly, slowly gaining the trust of Big Jim's inner circle. Terence and Jack were hearing really good things about Lewis. They heard that he was one of the biggest horse thieves in the country, and that he'd also recently made a killing robbing a tannery with his friend Billy Brown. He sounded like just the right kind of person to take Herbert Nelson's place. Terence and Jack sidled up to Lewis. They were going to test him to see if he was trustworthy. They asked him if he wanted to earn a few bucks. Maybe, Lewis replied. It depended what they wanted him to do. Lewis was definitely not prepared for their response. Body snatching, they said. A very rich man had died in Kenosha. They were going to steal the body and ransom it for a huge amount of money. Lewis told them that he needed to think it over. He sensed that something fishy was going on, that it was a feeler, a test of some kind. You see, rumours spread quickly in the criminal underworld of Chicago. If Lewis blabbed about the body snatching plot, word would soon get round to Terence and Jack. A week went by and they heard nothing. Lewis had passed the test. The next night they took Lewis into a secret room in the back of the hub and told him all about the plan to steal Lincoln's body. Lewis let them know that they had come to the right man for help. I'm the boss body snatcher of Chicago, he said. He managed to convince them that he'd done this sort of thing many times before. He was an expert. Lewis excitedly rushed off to tell Patrick the news. Patrick laughed. What nonsense was Lewis going on about? He thought that Lewis must have been drunk. The plan was so outlandish, so silly. Lewis assured him that he was sober and told Patrick enough details about the plan to convince him that it was true. Now, this was technically outside of the Secret Service's remit, but Patrick eventually got the go-ahead to foil the body-snatching plot. Terence, Jack and Lewis started adding the finishing touches to the plan. There were two problems that they faced: getting through the padlock steel gate and opening the marble sarcophagus. Lewis told them that they needed a top-notch cracksman for the job, and recommended none other than his good friend Billy Brown. This was the man that supposedly helped Lewis rob the tannery, but in reality he was just a bricklayer called Billy Neely, certainly not a criminal. Billy made a good impression on Terence and Jack. He was very convincing, and he came up with a way to get into Lincoln's marble sarcophagus. A hole could be drilled in it, Billy said, and powder put in and fused, and the whole thing blown to pieces. That settled it. Billy was welcomed into the gang. The next step was to set a date. They settled on election night. It would be perfect. Everyone would be distracted by celebrations, and the Lincoln Monument would be empty. The big day was finally around the corner, and the four-man gang boarded the overnight train to Springfield, armed with a large bag of tools. Little did they know that Patrick and his team were on the train too. Lewis suggested that the gang stood up. They'd draw less attention that way, he said. But really, it was just a clever ploy, so that A, he could keep reporting back to Patrick, and B, his friend Billy could make an escape. Billy was no criminal. He was an honest bricklayer, and there was no way on earth he was actually going to get caught up in this ridiculous body-snatching scheme. When the train slowly passed through Burlington, Billy jumped off and went back to his normal, law-abiding life. Lewis now had to come up with all kinds of excuses for why Billy wasn't around. When they arrived at Springfield, he told Terence and Jack that Billy was fast asleep on the train, and that he would come and wake him before the train departed from the station at 7 AM. Next, he told them that Billy had gone off to fetch a horse and a wagon for their getaway that night. The two men trusted Lewis, so believed his story. They told him to get Billy to drive up to the cemetery in the wagon for 9:30 PM and to whistle as a signal. Now, Lewis really had his work cut out for him. He frantically rushed between Big Jim's gang and Patrick's team. He was now briefed on what he had to do at the monument from the Secret Services side. Patrick's team would hide in the Memorial Hall. Once Big Jim's gang had started opening the sarcophagus, Lewis was to quietly slip away and use the password WASH. Patrick and his team would then catch the gang in the act. Patrick and his operatives got to the Memorial Hall early, 2 hours before Big Jim's gang. Each man got into position, taking off their shoes. Their hard soles made an awful racket on the marble floor. They waited in silence, the air charged with anticipation. The gang arrived at 9 PM. Perfect. The monument looked deserted and it was pitch black. No one would be able to see them. Lewis and Jack checked that the coast was clear. They had a look around and made their way up to the Memorial Hall using a bullseye lantern to light their way. They checked the door. It was locked. Good. Lewis shone the light in through the window and Patrick quickly hid, just narrowly missing detection. It looked like the coast was clear, and even if Lewis did see something, he would have denied it anyway. They snuck up to the doors of the tomb chamber, and Terence pried open the first wooden door with ease. Piece of cake. Next was the trickier part, the padlock. Terence took a hacksaw out of the bag and began trying to saw his way through it. It was taking forever. Lewis managed to slip away under the guise of making a check. He let Patrick know that the gang was trying to get through the padlock. Patrick told him to go back and help. Now was not the time to nab them. He needed to catch them in the act of grave robbing. Terence was still trying to saw his way through the padlock when the hacksaw broke. "Splendid saw," he mumbled, his frustration growing. He took out a 3-cornered file, carried on, then used a pair of pliers to finish the job. After what seemed like an absolute lifetime, they were finally in the tomb chamber. Lewis tried to sneakily slip away again, but Terence was having none of it. He ordered Lewis to stay and aimed the lantern at the sarcophagus so they could see what they were doing. They managed to pry the top lid of the sarcophagus using the axe like a lever. Then they had to deal with the much heavier marble lid that was concreted on. They chipped away at the cement seal with an axe and a chisel. All 3 men then pushed the heavy lid till it slowly slid off. Patrick and his men could hear all the clanking and banging. One of Patrick's operatives suggested that they make their move now, but Patrick insisted that now wasn't the time.
What was he waiting for?
Who knows? Lewis started to panic. He needed to alert Patrick somehow, so he began frantically swinging the bullseye lantern, hoping to catch somebody's attention. Terence, understandably, was not impressed. "Look out! Be careful!" he snarled. They began dragging the coffin out of the marble sarcophagus. It was now 9:30 PM and they hadn't heard a whistle yet. Where on earth was Billy? Terence told Lewis to go and find him. Relief rushed over Lewis. When he was out of sight, he made his way to the Memorial Hall. "Wash," he whispered. That was the password. Patrick opened the door, and Lewis told him that they'd begun to move the coffin. It was time for them to pounce. The operatives quickly made their way out of the hall. Patrick could feel the grass underneath his feet. Damn, he'd forgotten to put his shoes on. He'd just have to carry on in his socks. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. It echoed through the night air, tearing through the silence. Patrick spun around. His colleague's gun was smoking. It had accidentally gone off. There was no time to lose. The men ran to the tomb chamber. "Come out with your hands up!" Patrick yelled. Silence. "One wrong move and you're dead, men!" Still nothing. Patrick's heart sank. He lit a match. The chamber was empty. But thank goodness, the coffin was still there, and it was intact. He ordered his men to search the grounds. Patrick raced to get his boots, and then began to look for the grave robbers. He saw some figures moving in the darkness. "Halt!" he yelled, but they didn't obey. Patrick fired his gun and was greeted with return fire. The figures quickly hid behind some stone pedestals. Patrick shot at them again, and once again, they shot back. Patrick called out to his men for backup. Then, a voice came from behind the pedestal. "Patrick, is that you?" Two men gingerly popped their heads out. It was Patrick's operatives. He had been shooting at his own men. By this point, Terence, Jack and Lewis had made their escape. Terence and Jack walked all night to get as far away from the scene of the crime as possible, hiding each time they heard the wheels of a wagon. They would lie low for a while. Very sensible. Terence asked a friend to get in contact with Lewis and ask if the coast was clear. Of course, he responded that it was. Before long, both Terence and Jack were back at the hub having a great beer-fueled time, still completely unaware that Lewis was a roper. Lewis, of course, informed Patrick, and he arranged for the two men's arrest. They were sentenced to 1 year in prison. When they were released, Terence found out that Big Jim had done him dirty. He'd sold the hub, pocketed all the money for himself, and run off. So later, Terence would get his revenge. He would rat Big Jim out, letting Jim 2 years in jail. Lewis, our hero,
Hero my bum, I was rooting for the body snatchers.
who became known as the Prince of Ropers, unfortunately couldn't stay on the right side of the law. He was arrested for robbery and sentenced to 12 years behind bars. And what about Ben Boyd, the engraver extraordinaire, the catalyst for this whole ridiculous plot? Well, no one ever managed to break him out. He served his full sentence and was released after 10 years. He went back to work as an engraver, this time doing 100% legal, honest work at a factory. As for Lincoln's body, luckily, you can all rest easy, knowing that it's now perfectly safe. The Lincoln Monument Association had a deep hole dug in the tomb chamber floor. His body now lies under many, many feet of concrete. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, never trust a Coney man, they'll stab you in the back. And I hope you have a magnificent day.